welcome back. This is section 6, menus and shortcuts. I'm Rachel, and I'll be moderating the presentation of these last two papers. First, we'll hear a presentation from Blaine Lewis entitled KeyMap, Improving Keyboard Shortcut Vocabulary Using Norman's Mapping.
Hi. In this talk, I'll introduce a new interaction technique to help improve keyboard shortcut vocabulary using Norman's mapping. This is work I performed while I was completing my master's degree at the University of Waterloo, as well as a research assistantship at the University of Canterbury. The idea behind KeyMap is extremely simple. Rather than showing keyboard shortcuts in linear menus and hidden in panels, instead we show them directly on top of a virtual keyboard, and we take advantage of using the principle of rehearsal. But before I get into the specifics of exactly how KeyMap works, I first want to motivate why keyboard shortcuts are important to focus on. And the biggest reason for this are keyboard shortcuts are really fast. You don't have to home back and forth between the keyboard and the mouse, and you're also not constrained by the steering law or Fitts law. Keyboard keys don't get bigger or smaller depending on how many keyboard shortcuts we choose. As well, the mouse stays in the work area. You don't have to bounce back and forth between a toolbar as well and back to your work area. So keyboard shortcuts are really fast, but nobody uses them. Only 19% of Windows Firefox users use Control F to invoke the find command. So why don't people use them? And there's quite a few reasons for this. One of those reasons is that people suffer from the production bias. And the production bias is the idea that we are unwilling to sacrifice our productivity now to have more productivity in the future. And another psychological bias we fall victim to is satisficing. And satisficing is the idea that when you have to make a decision, every decision we make costs us time and energy. And so when we make these decisions and we have to choose between things, rather than looking at each candidate option, instead we only look at candidate options until we reach one that is good enough and it reaches some threshold. And so what happens is we look at linear menus because they're the first things we encounter, and we see and we click them and oh, it's good enough. And that's great for short term when we make a decision once, but when we make that decision once and then we execute that decision over and over again as we use computers more and more, then we suffer from the results of that decision. And in the fact keyboard shortcuts are so much faster that it would make sense to have made a decision earlier that was to use keyboard shortcuts instead. But in this talk, I really want to focus on two other reasons, which are that keyboard shortcuts are really hard to remember. So when we look at the current state of things on the right here, we can see a linear menu, and in that linear menu, we can see that there are the commands and as well as the shortcuts. But the shortcuts are kind of put off to the side, so we don't see them. And the other problem is that there's nothing really there that helps us associate and remember them. It only tells us what the label is, but we don't know where it is or any other information to help us remember it. And then the second problem I want to approach in this is that their keyboard shortcuts are really hard to discover as well. As I mentioned, the keyboard shortcut is in the far right of that linear menu, so most times we don't even notice it, so we never know what it is. And then further to that, we also have a panel on the right that says keyboard shortcuts on it, and it lists all the keyboard shortcuts in an application, but to open that panel in the first place, we needed to know the keyboard shortcut command / to open the panel. And so keyboard shortcuts are really hard to discover. And not only that, but current interfaces make them hard to remember because they don't help us out at all. Prior work has explored how we can improve this. For example, Grossman et al. Looked at various methods such as delay methods as well as using audio feedback to help people learn keyboard shortcuts. Expose HK, which I'll talk about a little bit more in depth later, looked at how we can use rehearsal to make sure that novices and experts do the same thing and help us hopefully improve keyboard shortcut use. And then another related work to ours is Hotkey Palette, which displays command labels, or not command labels, instead it displays windows on top of a virtual keyboard. The key principle behind KeyMap is Norman's mapping. And the best way to explain Norman's mapping is by using stoves. On the left we see a stove, and we can see 4 burners, and then across the bottom we also have 4 dials that control those burners. But when we see that the burners are arranged in a square, but the dials are arranged in a line, it's unclear which dial controls which burner, because we could have said that we could have put them in clockwise order, or maybe we would have went counterclockwise, or maybe we did the first row and then the second row. It's entirely unclear from just looking at the dials what the mapping is between what dial controls what stove. But instead, if we follow a more natural mapping, like placing the dials in a square and the burners also in a square, then it becomes extremely clear which dial controls which stove. And so we want to apply that principle of Norman's mapping to keyboard shortcuts, because in the current state of things, it's not the case. There's no mapping between how I enter these keyboard shortcuts and how they're displayed. So what does Norman's mapping look like for keyboard shortcuts? Well, it looks like KeyMap. Rather than showing keyboard shortcuts hidden away in linear menus, instead we show them as a first-class citizen directly on top of a virtual keyboard. And in this virtual keyboard visualization, we also use other things to help your memory. We add landmarks, just like on your keyboard has on F and J, and that allows you to remember things in association to a physical landmark. And then we also show all of the labels across all of the keys. And the way KeyMap works is very simple. In order to open it, you press and hold a keyboard shortcut modifier like Command or Control. And after a very short delay, the keyboard shortcut visualization appears. And now we can look for the command that we wanted to enter, say it was bookmark, and then we complete the selection by pressing D on our keyboard. And that completes the selection in guided mode. However, for expert users, they don't need guided mode, which is the reason behind having that short delay is now experts don't ever see KeyMap, because when they enter a keyboard shortcut that they already know, then KeyMap doesn't have to appear, they just press the shortcut. However, we also support very novice users by allowing novice users to click through KeyMap. I can take my mouse and I can click on Command, and then that opens the keyboard shortcut visualization. And now I can click on bookmark, for example, to complete a selection. And that executes a command. So earlier I talked about how KeyMap improves keyboard shortcut vocabulary, but I haven't talked about why. So what are the principles that help KeyMap improve our memory of keyboard shortcuts? And one of the biggest things that KeyMap supports is stronger cue target association. When we have to remember a keyboard shortcut, we're performing a cued recall process, where we have a cue, such as something in the menu or the menu that helps us remember it, and then we have a target, which is what we want to remember, which is the physical keyboard shortcut. And so in the case of the current state of things, the cue is going to be the linear menu. And if you look at the target's the same in both cases, but it's not clear what the association is between a linear menu and a keyboard. However, with KeyMap, this association is quite clear and quite strong. We can see that those images look almost identical to one another. So there's a very strong cue target association with KeyMap, which should help people remember it. Another principle behind KeyMap is the idea of spatial memory. Keyboard shortcuts are sometimes arranged in semantic groupings. So things like cut, copy, and paste are arranged beside each other on the keyboard, but linear menus don't make this obvious. There are other groupings like find and replace, Control F and Control H are also placed near each other, but it's unclear as a user that they're placed near each other by simply looking at the menu. Whereas KeyMap makes it extremely clear that cut, copy, and paste, or find and replace, are placed directly beside each other. And so we can leverage our spatial memory when we remember keyboard shortcuts using KeyMap. And finally, KeyMap also takes advantage of incidental learning. We can remember shortcuts without ever entering them. So when we say we enter save all the time, we might have noticed that bookmark is beside save. And now when we press save, or when we want to bookmark something, if we want to bookmark something now, then we don't know what the shortcut is, but we know that it's beside save. So we can actually enter bookmark without ever opening KeyMap, just by pressing Command D, because we know it's beside save. And so KeyMap supports incidental learning. But now that we have these principles and we have this idea that KeyMap helps improve memory, we also want to evaluate KeyMap and compare it to the state of the art. And we did this using a controlled crowdsourced experiment. We compared KeyMap to ExposeHK. ExposeHK is another interaction technique designed to help people remember keyboard shortcuts and learn them. And it does that by when you press and hold a keyboard shortcut modifier, all of the linear menu is open. And now a novice can press one of those and enter a keyboard shortcut by pressing another button on their keyboard. In this way, novice users emulate expert users and perform the exact same task, thereby rehearsing as an expert, even though they're only a novice. And we have a few hypotheses about how KeyMap is going to compare to ExposeHK. We hypothesize that KeyMap users will remember more shortcuts, they will incidentally learn more shortcuts, and KeyMap users will also have faster practice selection times than ExposeHK. Our experiment looked a little bit like this. We have a progress bar across the top that occurred in a web browser. They were given the stimulus in the center of the screen, and then their keyboard shortcut interface would show as well. This is what KeyMap looked like, and then ExposeHK looked similar except across the top rather than the bottom. Participants in our study performed two tasks. The first task was a selection task, and users would use the keyboard shortcut interface they were assigned to select a task using either guided mode, where they can see the keyboard shortcut interface, or they could enter it without seeing it, and users were also able to click through the menu. Our participants were also asked to complete a recall task, and in the recall task, all of the visual elements of the keyboard shortcut interface they were given were hidden. And so they would enter keyboard shortcuts in order to recall them, given a stimulus, and they would continue through. And there's not much to see here because we explicitly made sure they could not see the keyboard shortcut interface they were assigned. Our experiment design was a between-subject design. We had two conditions, ExposeHK and KeyMap. We recruited 98 Mechanical Turk crowd workers, and those crowd workers, each participant was assigned 13 different commands, and we distributed those using a Zipf distribution. The Zipf distribution was used to emulate real command use, where some commands are used more frequently than others, like copy is used much more frequently than replace. In the selection task, they performed 25 trials, and they performed 6 blocks of these 25 trials. Following that, they performed a recall task where they were asked to recall all 13 commands, and then 5 commands they've never seen before to test incidental learning. After 24 hours, they came back and performed the retention task, where they did the same thing as the recall task, recalling 13 commands and then 5 incidental ones. The results of our experiment show that KeyMap improved short-term recall. We found a statistically significant difference between the median number of commands that KeyMap users remembered and then ExposeHK users remembered. KeyMap users remembered 10 commands, and ExposeHK users remembered 9. This plot you see here is similar to a violin plot, but for discrete distributions. We can see the frequency across the bottom, where we have higher frequency commands, such as our cut, copy, and paste, on the very far right, and we can see that there's no difference. The same number of users users remembered the same number of commands as if they were in KeyMap or ExposeHK, which is they got most of them correct. And then as we get to lower frequency commands, we start to see a difference between KeyMap and ExposeHK. And this shows that KeyMap users are remembering low frequency commands more often than ExposeHK users are. Moving on to the long-term retention test, we found a statistically significant difference again, showing that KeyMap users remembered more commands than ExposeHK users did 24 hours after the original practice selection task. And we see the same pattern where KeyMap users remember more low-frequency commands than ExposeHK users do. We also found that KeyMap likely creates incidental learning. Users were asked to recall commands they hadn't entered before, And we found that KeyMap users remembered 19 commands, and Expose HK users remembered 6 commands. And this is spread across all participants. So all participants in the KeyMap condition remembered 19, and Expose HK remembered 6. Because this effect size is very small, we think that we should explore this more in future work to demonstrate that KeyMap definitely creates incidental learning. We also found no evidence that KeyMap is faster than Expose HK. The mean selection time of KeyMap was directly comparable to Expose HK, as being just a little bit over 3 seconds. We did find that there's no difference between Expose HK and KeyMap in the first block, which was slightly surprising because we thought that KeyMap was very novel to users, and they've never seen anything like this. We expected that in at least the first block, KeyMap users would be slower than Expose HK. So to conclude our experiment section, KeyMap users remembered more shortcuts, and we also found that KeyMap users incidentally learned more shortcuts. However, we didn't find any evidence to support hypothesis 3, which was that KeyMap users have faster practice selection times than Expose HK users do. We also created a Chrome extension. You can use this Chrome extension and download it. It's available in the Chrome Web Store. And this is the really cool thing about KeyMap, is that you can drop it into any application that exists right now. It just drops in. Because it sits in the bottom left, it's not obscuring anything, and it's very easy to use, as demonstrated here. Here is me using it to rate our paper. I'm turning some text bold as well as italics, and I'm using keyboard shortcuts to do so. The Chrome extension also works for other applications like Dynalist and Slack, and is open source, which means that if you want to add more applications to it, you can go ahead and do that. For future work, we'd like to generalize the use of Norman's mapping for assisting memory to other interfaces. For example, we only showed that Norman's mapping works for keyboard shortcuts and keyboard visualizations, but we think that this principle is generalizable, and maybe we could use it to improve memory of other things. For example, VR menus sometimes show a controller, and we think that there's a good chance that this improves that this improves memory of those command locations. We also want to explore feedback using KeyMap. When you click on a toolbar, it seems like the obvious extension is that if you click on bold in your toolbar, then KeyMap should show Command B on the screen so that you know that the keyboard shortcut is Command B to remind you. To conclude, KeyMap is a new interaction technique that leverages a keyboard visualization to improve keyboard shortcut vocabulary. Thank you for listening to this talk.
Thank you. That was a really clear and informative presentation. So we're going to move on to the question and answer period. So first, from the comments, we have a question. Are hotkeys really hard to discover? Okay, the hidden ones that require more than one command, but are the ones for the commands in menus aren't they rather salient? Is it that they don't come up often and come up in your mind when you're about to select them for a command?
I think that's a really good question, and it requires us to kind of distinguish what discoverability means. There's kind of explicit discoverability where I have to like open something to find them, and then there's implicit discoverability where I'd have to look harder to find it. And I think you make a really good point about when our eyes search, when we open a linear menu, our eyes are actually scanning along the left side because that's where we can find the command labels. I'm uncertain what the best way to call that is whether it's discoverability or not, but it's definitely a lack of visibility. And there's also other cases other than just linear menus where maybe we're using a toolbar, and to see them on a toolbar, we have to hover. So hotkeys are either hard to discover or hard to see, I guess.
Okay. The next question is, how does it work for hotkeys that require more than 2 keys so that are mapped to the same base key?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the way it works is that you would have an individual key map for each combination of hotkeys. So if I was pressing Command and Option at the same time, then it would show different labels.
Mm,
It's not a great design because it's hard to discover them because we'd have to flip between them to find different hotkeys. But we're hoping that designers can adopt our approach and they can take advantage of it. And maybe for hotkeys like Shift, you could actually show them on the same key map because Shift often does the opposite, such as undo and redo. If you press Command Shift Z in a lot of cases, it'll redo rather than undo. And we're hoping designers can take advantage of that. In this study, we focused on a single layer of keymap because we were interested in memorability for just that set of commands, and we were curious if the base case of keymap would work or not.
okay. So the last question in the chat is, one good design for some of the current drop-down menus is that they've applied Miller's Law. They only show limited items and use nested lists. Are there any design considerations that KeyMap applied relating to this?
This is a really interesting question. I'm not familiar with Miller's Law, but it sounds like this is trying to favor depth over breadth, whereas a lot of design suggests that we should actually be favoring breadth. I think depth is really cool, and the really cool thing about KeyMap is we can support that. Keyboard shortcuts already support this through something called chorded shortcuts, where I might press Command X or Command Z or Control Z, I think in many cases, and then Command Y, I think, puts VS Code into Zen mode. So I've now put two keyboard shortcuts together and chorded them. And the cool thing about KeyMap is we can actually support that, where you could use like the first key press to open a submenu, and then the second short key press to actually execute a command. So we could support this kind of more hierarchical nested list version of using KeyMap for that.
Thank you. So another question is, how do you see KeyMap being integrated into other sorts of applications aside from web browsers?
Aside from web browsers,
Well,
I
like
so
current implementations.
For sure, yeah. So I think there's a lot of different ways we could see KeyMap being used. Right now, we're using it in kind of a boring way in the sense that we don't have many icons on the keys or anything like that. But I can imagine this being used in Photoshop, where you have all of your brushes and stuff, and you could represent that entire toolbar directly on a key map, and then you could see where things are. And it might make sense to actually like spatially distribute some things in better ways. Like you put all the selection tools together, and then you put maybe the painting tools in another spot. And I think it would be a really visually pleasing way of dealing with things in Photoshop and learning some of those shortcuts a little bit better.
That seems like a really cool application. So another question is, keyboard shortcut mappings may also depend on the context of the activity, like Command plus C in Finder may does something different than what it will do in a different application context. How does KeyMap deal with such situations? Is it context aware, basically?
So KeyMap would be context aware if it was implemented across global things. It would always just represent the underlying shortcut mappings, no matter where you are. It does raise an interesting point, though, that sometimes your spatial groupings might not work. But this is kind of a problem with all shortcuts, and this is something that I believe we identified as a problem in our prior work, where we did an interview with people about using shortcuts, and we found that having inconsistent shortcuts is really confusing to people. And whenever possible, we should actually make them as consistent as possible.
Okay, thank you so much. That's all the time we have for questions, but thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you very
Next, we'll hear from Jay Henderson, who will be presenting the paper, Investigating the Necessity of Delay in Marking Menu Invocation.
Hey everyone, so my name is Jay Henderson from the University of Waterloo, and I'm here to talk to you today about investigating the necessity of delay in marking menu invocation. This work was done alongside my collaborators, Sylvain Malacria, Mathieu Nancel, and Edward Lank, as a joint effort between the University of Waterloo, INRIA, and the University of Lille. So first and foremost, what are marking menus? Marking menus were developed by Gordon Kurtenbach over 25 years ago, and since then they've been heavily studied and extended in HCI because they introduced this principle of rehearsal in interfaces, so users can move seamlessly from novice to expert interactions. So marking menus are radial menus that rely on two main modes of interaction. The first is a menu mode, where the user presses down an input device, waits for a predetermined delay that's usually 1/3 of a second, and then the menu appears. After this, the user can then move their input device in the direction of a desired command. So in this video, the user moves right, then down to select coffee in menu mode. The second mode is mark mode. So if the user knows the directional strokes to select something, for example, we now know that coffee is right then down, then they can complete the selection without waiting for this predetermined delay. So in essence, users can rehearse the exact interaction to make a selection in menu mode to be able to perform it in mark mode. So as described in the title, we're talking about this particular delay for switching between modes. But since the user is rehearsing the exact same interaction, why not just display the menu all of the time? So prior work has justified this with a few reasons. The first is that the menu can be distracting. The menu can obliterate part of the screen. Displaying the menu takes time. And delay might provide an incentive to use the mark mode, which is expected to be faster than menu mode. So while this delay has received little criticism in the literature, we note a few potential drawbacks. First, the delay can serve as a penalty to users who are unfamiliar with the menu or command. The mark mode requires that users memorize the often arbitrary strokes associated with selection, which may use up more cognitive resources that could have been dedicated to the task at hand. And lastly, users may try to select commands using the mark mode when they're not actually sure if the stroke corresponds to their desired selection, which in turn may increase error rate. So pictured here is a figure from one of the original marking menu papers. However, for example, we would imagine with the advances of computers in the past 2 decades, displaying a menu would take less than 15% of a second. Thus, we wanted to explore a no delay or immediately displayed marking menu, which is shown in the augmented diagram, where the user does not have to wait for menu mode, but can still rely on the recognition of menu items if they choose to do so. We wish to study these two menu interfaces, the original marking menus and immediately displayed marking menus, to see how they fared against each other. So to more concretely visualize this, here is an example of selection comparing these two marking menus that we looked at. With 3 controlled studies, we explored the following research questions. First, are immediately displayed menus faster for command selection? Do immediately displayed menus have a lower error rate? For extremely practice use, is there a benefit for incorporating mark mode? And lastly, are delayed marking menus with mark mode less visually disruptive? So the first study aimed to tackle the first 2 questions. In our first study, each participant saw both the delay and no delay marking menu in 4 different configurations to get an idea of what typical command selection might reveal. So we had a 2x4x10 within subject's design with factors of marking menu condition, that was either delay or no delay, 4 menu configurations, so 4 item, 8 item, 4x4 and 8x8, and blocks with 10 blocks of 8 target commands per menu condition and configuration. We'll also note that all interactions were done using a mouse. So with 16 participants, 2 menu conditions, 10 blocks, and 1 configuration with 4 targets, plus 3 configurations with 8 targets, we had 8,960 selections overall. First, looking at time, we analyzed time as a whole denoted by selection time. So this was the time from the prompt appearing to the user actually making a selection. This was then broken down further into execution time and preparation time. And execution time was the time the user's mouse was pressed to its release, and preparation time was the time from the prompt appearing to the user pressing down. And overall, we found that selection time was significantly greater for a delayed menu, And in the graphs here, we see that overall selection time and preparation time improved for a no delay marking menu. Around block 4 or 5, execution time appears to converge, and preparation appears to move onto separate trajectories. So next we'll look at error rates, and to contextualize this, the top of the figure shows the distribution of modes used by block in the delay condition. So you can see mark mode was used more frequently as block increased. The bottom shows error rate, and we see that a no delay menu appears fairly consistent, but as mark mode use increases, so does error rate for the delay condition. Overall, we found that error rate was significantly higher with a delayed marking menu than one with no delay. So we found that these immediately displayed or no delay marking menus have significant advantages over delayed marking menus for both time and error rate. And even for practice use, in the latter of the 10 blocks, delayed marking menus had higher error rates and reaction times. However, if we revisit this graph, we notice that for execution time, timing seemed to be improving for delay, so we wanted to look into this usage further. Which brings us to the next research question. In study 2, that is, for extremely practice use, is there a benefit for incorporating mark mode? For this study, to simulate an expert user, we asked participants to perform one of 2 commands to minimize memorization requirements, but to preserve the unpredictable prompt. The study design was similar to the first, but with only 2 menus. Each participant also saw both the delay and no delay marking menu. So we had a 2x2 within subjects design with factors of marking menu condition, 2 target commands to select, and 8 blocks of 10 selections per target. So 8 participants times 2 commands times 10 prompts and 8 blocks resulted in 2,560 selections overall. The graph here depicts each directional stroke with their execution time for no delay and delayed marking menus. So in the extremely practice use case, we found that the delayed marking menus were significantly faster by about 260 milliseconds than immediately displayed marking menus. We did not find any significant differences in terms of preparation time or error rate. So taking this into consideration, to synthesize the results of these 2 quantitative studies, we found in study 1 an overall advantage for immediately displayed marking menus for time and error. However, in study 2, delayed marking menus showed a time improvement. For our last research question, we wanted to see whether or not an immediately displayed marking menu would be visually disruptive to its users, as was theorized in the original marking menu. So this video shows an example of what the study looked like. We asked participants to recreate the image in the above panel using a marking menu. So the user would spawn the elements of the image using a marking menu. So specifically, we chose this task because we expect occlusion to be an issue when manipulating items with contextual menus, such as rotate, and that there would be many items to select, thus heavy usage of the marking menu. So again, we had a within subjects design where participants saw each marking menu delay type, that is, delay and no delay, and had to create 2 images per marking menu conditions for 4 recreations in total. To reduce learning effects, command sets for the menu were different per delay condition. During the interaction, participants were instructed to talk out loud through the process of creating the image. After each marking menu delay condition was complete, participants were asked a series of questions related to their interaction. So here are the results of the qualitative data. The questions were specifically designed to probe for impacts of visual disruption. While there's lots of information in the graph, we only found significant difference for question H. That is, for the condition made me lose focus on my main task, delay was more problematic than an immediately displayed marking menu for loss of focus. The Think Aloud data revealed some more insights on whether or not visual disruption is an issue. First, P12 noted that they noticed no disturbance or disruption since they would always be able to control visibility of the menu by releasing the mouse button. However, P6 noted an issue that they could not see which direction an item was facing, as it was occluded by the menu, so they were unsure of how to rotate it. But participant 15 said the delay condition is slow because users want to be able to do a process as fast as they can without waiting. So we found in study 1 a reduced performance for delayed marking menus, but increase in timing for study 2. Therefore, extensive training is required to overcome these performance costs introduced by delay. And since we looked at expertise with only 2 commands, it's unclear whether users can reach expertise with enough of the commands to actually benefit from the delay. In study 3, we were unable to find this impact of visual disruption that was an issue when marking menus were first developed. This raises the question of whether or not visual occlusion is overstated and whether or not it can be mitigated. So what's next for this work? To start, marking menus are a very unique use case, and it's unclear whether these results would generalize to other rehearsal-based interfaces, so this could be an interesting avenue to explore. Second, while we use the original 1/3 of a second delay, shorter delays, such as those used now in commercial systems, may help to mitigate drawbacks of delay. And while there were some indications of visual disruption, such as the occlusion of items, we wonder if this could be mitigated by, for example, a partially transparent menu so its users can still see content underneath the menu. So to conclude, we presented a quantitative and qualitative exploration of the costs and benefits of incorporating delay in marking menus. As to whether or not a designer or developer should incorporate delay using marking menus, it really depends on whether the system design should penalize novice or casual use to optimize this highly practiced expert use. With that being said, I thank you for viewing my talk, and I hope this paper inspires some future work on delay-separated modes. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Now it's time for the Q&A. So the first question is about study artifacts. So when you studied how people perform when they're in highly practiced mode in experiment 2, they were reacting to a prompt. Do you think that they perform differently when they're using an application they're very familiar with and not reacting to instructions on screen?
Hey, Nikhita, great question. So actually, I mean, I feel like that's kind of what we looked at in experiment 3. People became very familiar, especially with contextual menus. They wanted to do manipulations like rotate. And really, when people are, we found is when people are using an application that they may not necessarily be focused on being super fast, and they do perform differently, and they may not necessarily be focused on being as quick as possible, but just focused on getting the right output.
Sense. So in regards to the 260 millisecond speed increase for the delayed mouse, does this sort of imply that you would recommend a menu that at first uses no delay and then slowly added delay for specific commands? So a menu that sort of learnt as users went?
Yeah, so that's also a good question. I think that's kind of outside of the scope of this work, but I think there are many different avenues with this, and working on a system that gradually increases delay, force people to want to learn more. That being said, is that best way to people to interact with their system? Hard to say, because if they're using a system where it's really important to be super fast, I think the delay would be more important because the penalty would be more important in forcing them to learn. But if they're using a system like hours where you were just manipulating items and kind of drawing a picture that's a bit more relaxed. And perhaps using a delay is not necessarily the best approach.
So you think that it's very context dependent. Where are these marking menus most common? And what sort of places do you think that a delay might be beneficial or not beneficial in terms of like the most extreme cases?
Oh, definitely. So that's also a great question. But there's kind of two ways I can answer this, and the first is that marking menus, from what I understand, are only really used a couple of systems. One of them being Autodesk Maya. And there's kind of a disjoint between the literature and the way industry applies these menus. And so, from speaking with the person who created marking menus, he said that in industry, they've all but gotten rid of the delay. It's down to like maybe 150 milliseconds. But in the literature, people are more of these delays, and there's kind of just like a disjoint here. I guess the point is for this to inspire more research on whether or not these delays are important, whether or not they're required for different systems.
That makes sense. So in terms of the device that you use to measure, why did you choose the mouse? And in future, are you going to conduct similar studies with trackpads or touchscreens?
So I definitely think that maybe the results could be different for touchscreens or trackpads. I know that a lot of different touch devices use a long press to kind of switch between two modes. We used a mouse because it's probably the easiest starting point, and that's kind of one of the most fundamental ways people use their computers. That being said, we've moved more to trackpads now. But it was just a starting point, and definitely future research should look at that. Maybe I will.
Okay. I don't see any more questions in the chat. Do you have any more comments on your work or any other future directions you want to talk about?
I think that's about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Okay, so that concludes session 6 on menus and shortcuts. I'm going to pass it off to the chairs for some concluding remarks.
All right, so we're at the end of our scheduled program, and before we wrap things up, we'd just like to thank everyone who made today possible.
We would like to thank all of our presenters today. Without your hard work and interesting research, today would not have been possible. So thank you, and we look forward to seeing your future research.
Second, we'd like to thank our session chairs for volunteering their time to lead the Q&A sessions. So thank you to Quinton Roy, Cheryl Lau, Joseph Tu, Diana Cotter, Johan Wenzel, and Rachel Wu.
We would also like to thank Tanhei Singhel for developing the website and keeping it up to date, and Marissa Benjamin for helping with promoting the event and preparing material for the chairs.
We would also like to thank Jim Wallace and Leonard Nake for their support and help acquiring and testing various streaming services.
Last but certainly not least, we would like to thank you, our audience. We hope that you had a good time, and we hope to see you again at future events.
One final note, we'd also like to thank Kaylee MacArthur for doing a lot of promotions on Twitter. We really appreciate it, and thank you to everyone who shared the event, and again, everyone who joined us. Thank you so much.